We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place by storytelling and through the sharing of experiences. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello today, my name is Anthony Caruana and on behalf of CIM, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the fourth in a series on the future of property operations. And today we're going to explore the role of operations in driving superior asset performance. Following the success of our previous webinars, we look forward to facilitating another equally insightful session, and we're delighted to see so many of our passionate and curious industry colleagues listening in again today. The acknowledgement of country that we started with is about storytelling and sharing information, and that's the spirit in which we're approaching this session today. And that's why our panel today has these great industry experts who are going to share their stories, and hopefully you'll be able to ask them a few questions along the way and share some of your insights as we go along. Our panel today are all really passionate about property investment, asset performance, and accelerating progress towards a sustainable future for the built environment. So today I'd like to welcome Emily, Ed, and Dave. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thank you.
Emily is the Managing Director of Asset Management Australia for LaSalle. She has close to 20 years of industry experience, including roles at CBRE and JLL, and has a track record in the delivery of financial, physical, and strategic property management in Australia and in Europe. Ed O'Brien is Fund Manager for Strada Office Fund. He has over 15 years of experience in the commercial real estate industry, including senior roles at AMP Capital and Colonial First State. And finally, we have Dave Walsh, the founder and CEO of CIM, our host today. CIM is a world-leading building analytics software company, and they've brought us together today for the discussion. Dave was inspired to create CIM because of the black hole he observed in the way data was being used in commercial buildings. So he and the CIM team work with major property players globally to drive operational efficiency through data-driven facilities management. Our panelists are going to dig deeply today into how operational efficiency is an important tool for maximising property value, profitability, and investment returns over the life cycle of a portfolio. As you're watching and listening, please feel free to shoot your questions through to the panel using the Q&A function. And if you could make sure, if that question is for someone specific, could you be really careful about making sure we know who that's for so that we direct the right questions to the right people. If we run out of time for questions during the webinar today, we're going to respond to you afterwards as well. So if we don't get to you, it doesn't mean we've missed you. It just means we haven't got you just quite yet. And at the end of the webinar, you'll receive a recording of the webinar shortly after. And we'll also have a very short survey, which is really important to us because it helps us refine what we do for the future so we can keep continuing to deliver great webinars, not just today, but ongoing. So we're going to kick off the discussion today with a look at operations and the all-important area of property operations. Ed, we hear a lot about actively managing and adding value to properties under management. What's that mean for Strada?
Thanks, Anthony. Well, I suppose our definition of active management and adding value really isn't that different from the broader industry. And really what that means, active management of real estate is simply the maximising of revenue and minimising of expenses. And if we were to take that a couple of steps further, active management can be really looked at over timeframes. In the immediate future, active asset management identifies what actions can be taken to minimise revenue and maximise revenue and minimise expenditure. Minimise expenditure in the short term, and generally those are things that can be readily delivered and easily accessed, and without really the need for significant amounts of capital expenditure. A good example of this at the operational level might be an LED lighting upgrade to reduce electricity costs and R&M, or identifying some underutilised space within the building and offering its tenants potentially as storage space. These are most likely the small wins, the low-hanging fruit per se. And then into the medium and longer term, active asset management is about identifying the opportunities within an asset to maximise revenues, minimise expenses that have larger gains. These can be found by looking at plant and equipment upgrades, potentially extending the building, NLA increases. And these strategies have a lead time, a longer lead time, and they almost certainly will include components of capital expenditure. So where these strategies come off, you can say you've added value to the asset. So essentially the two terms are really very much interlinked.
So, Emily, how important is boosting the productivity and workflow of your on-site teams? Where do they fit into this picture? And does that have an impact in overall asset performance and profitability?
Yeah, look, absolutely. You think, your teams on site have got a finite amount of time. We've all got a certain number of hours in the day, and what they're spending those hours on are hugely important. The difference between having your team spending all day trying to fix an air conditioning issue, which potentially, you can resolve, by using some, data-driven results or understanding where that problem's arising. That team's then suddenly free. There's a service request that goes through, you know what the problem is. And that team can be focusing on tenant relations. They can be, driving other items of what you need in the building that really add value. There's a big difference in being able to manage your asset on a reactive or a proactive basis. And, generally when you're responding to issues and problems on a reactive basis, it takes you a lot more time. It's a lot of problem solving, it's diving into the problem, and it's sort of that, layer by layer result. If you can jump straight to the problem and you're able to then suddenly start taking a forward-looking approach and, dealing with items that you can plan for, that you're spending time with tenants, that's a completely different ballgame. And, people don't suddenly have more hours in the day just because they've had to spend time fixing problems to do all the other stuff they want. So it's really about trying to have people in a situation where they can use their time most proactively, and that always adds value as far as I'm concerned.
Some of that must be music to your ears, Dave. Can you think of some great stories of property companies you work with where improved operations has been a huge driver of better asset performance?
Yeah, look, I mean, Emily and Ed are both like right on the money in the sense that better decision making within large organizations means you essentially are able to do a number of things. You're able to consolidate visualization into one area, so everyone's kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. Everyone's able to kind of pinpoint the inefficiencies quickly, and it's very, very frustrating when there is a prolonged problem in a building and no one can get to the bottom of it, because invariably what ends up happening is, I look at some stories we have scenarios. Let's say if you pick a couple of CBRE buildings, like 1 Spring Street or 99 Elizabeth Street, the buildings were able to significantly improve neighbours ratings by just being able to get to the bottom of anomalies and inefficiencies faster, and ensuring that the neighbours rating was kind of picked up and improved and then sustained. When you're able to do that, then that adds significant value to the type of tenant you're able to attract, and it also adds an awful lot to the kind of culture within the team, because arguments are rife when the facts are scarce, and there's nothing as bad as working in an environment where people are kind of in abrasive kind of discussions, trying to find a problem. And Ed touched on it then with equipment. We had a scenario when you're kind of looking and asking for stories, like QIC, they use our data and our technology to extend the life cycle of plant and equipment, because it's one thing to kind of upgrade plant and equipment as companies go on their net zero journey, but it's a whole other thing to take equipment that is underperforming and get it to its kind of optimal performance and then keep it there. QIC did that on a large volume of our chiller plant. Our technologies on 27 in their shopping centres, and they were able to end up doing data-driven CapEx, which really helps kind of people at a senior level, not just to do time-based capital equipment upgrades. So yeah.
So the good news is that the audience is super engaged and have already got questions for us. So I've got one for you, Emily, that's come in from the audience. How do you keep the ops team aligned with the asset or fund management team?
I think it's a case of communication. We've got all the data there, but what it comes back to is just, do your team on site understand what your drivers are? Every owner, every building is going to have a different set of drivers. Communicating with them clearly what those drivers are, having clear deliverables from them, regular meetings, touch and base, tracking progress. We've got some fabulous FM teams that we're very lucky to work with, and we've been, really pleased with some of the results we've been able to achieve.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, it's similar sort of comment is that it's so important that the whole team understands the strategy of the owner, and what the real drivers are, and where the owner sees the asset going in 1 year, 3 years, 10 years. What's the ultimate objective of the investment here? Because once your whole team know that, they can make the on-the-spot decisions and ask the right questions that can help influence those medium and longer term outcomes.
I might chime in as well, Anthony.
So yeah, go for it. Why not?
Why not? No, and I think a key thing with that, and obviously always coming at stuff with kind of a data hat on, is like good data ends up improving. Like for me, one of the key things within a team is accountability. And I've often found that like high performing team members love accountability. And it's very often the people who you kind of want may not value the culture, you know, of the company, that, you know, that whenever data shows that they're not stepping up and not being accountable for their functional area, then that can often be something that really kind of can create misalignment. But when you do end up having that data, it can actually help with that kind of communication chain all the way up to senior execs.
So I think there was one takeaway I pulled out of what the three of you just put in there, is that we talk about the ops team and we can talk about the funds team and we can talk about different teams, but ultimately they're actually all one team. And I think it's about making sure you've got the communication lines.
If you're working and you don't understand what the ultimate goal is, how do you make the decisions that are right to get to where it is? So it's super, it sounds like such a common sense thing, but you'd be surprised how many people you talk to where, you know, you're on site and it just hasn't filtered through to the team. They're not aware of what the drivers are. They're just, you know, managing it the same way they managed the last building or for the last owner. And there isn't had that conversation on what the actual drivers are, what's the focus and what's important.
So Ed, another question we've just had quickly come in from the audience is, can you give an example of some of the drivers an owner would have?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose it comes down to what the investment thesis is. And then I suppose that comes down to what the capital that has given you the money to invest in that asset, what their drivers are. So you might have a value add strategy whereby you get in and you solve some problems very quickly. Probably you're looking at a releasing campaign, a targeted CapEx campaign. As part of all of that, there's no doubt an improvement in an operational performance and efficiency aspect of the asset. And then you might be exiting within, you know, a window of time, 5 to 7 years, say, is generally sort of a pretty traditional timeframe for a strategy like that. Or you equally might have a core strategy, which is basically we're running this building, we're owning this building for the long term, and we are making long-term decision making. And there's a strategy to own this asset for 10 years plus. And how do we maximize the value of this asset over that time frame? And a lot of that decision making might come down in that particular strategy to doing things in the near term that might cost you a bit of money, but will deliver you returns over the longer horizon.
So there's a really important message here. It's about what's the time frame you're going to measure your ROI over? Is it a 5 to 7 year, or is it a 10-year plus, or a 20-year kind of frame? Because that's going to drive the types of decisions you're going to make and the sorts of investments you're going to make.
Yeah, that's it. And then that boils down to making sure everybody from the ground up understands what that strategy is, and how they will play a role in delivering.
And that comes back to Emily's point about communication. That's great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think everyone can, based on what we've just heard there, we can all agree that sustainability, operations, asset performance, they're all interlinked and interdependent with each other. Emily, like LaSalle is a signatory to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and has committed to support the goal of net zero by 2050 or sooner. What are some of the practical ways this comes to life in the operation of your properties? Can you give perhaps a specific or a couple of specific examples of properties?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Look, I think net zero carbon sort of, you know, the term's been around for a long time, but look, I don't know where everyone else sort of started doing this, but this is sort of a reasonably recent, you know, let's call it post-COVID and how we measure time nowadays. But, you know, post-COVID, net zero carbon, carbon neutral, you know, they're all the terms that are around. And we sit there and we go to the presentations and people say, we're going to reduce our carbon, we're going to be net zero carbon, you're going to make a 50% reduction by 2030. Well, okay, right. that's a lot, you know. So, you know, having a plan, we've now started doing sort of net zero carbon plans. You know, I think what I've boiled down to is when I got to the nuts and bolts of it, you know, we've got scope 1 carbon, which is essentially what we burn, scope 2 carbon, which is what we buy. They're sort of the main focuses in terms of the reduction initiatives for now. So sort of in my mind, when I translate that back to what does that actually mean, it's, you know, degasification of our buildings and looking at different options, mainly for our generator fuels. You know, that's what we burn. So we've been going through a program. We recently had problems, you know, with our domestic hot water units. So, you know, we made the decision with those units when we replaced them that we wouldn't replace like for like. We've obviously gone and taken the view that, well, you know, we could have put in gas ones now, but we've taken the decision to, you know, move to electric. You know, we'll probably get a slight hit in terms of running costs, but that was the only gas that building used. So we've taken that opportunity, and because we were sort of aware that when we made life cycle replacements, that's something that we need to consider in the longer term, we were able to make those decisions on plant replacement to degasify a building reasonably simply with capital that was already budgeted. So that was a great win for us. And, you know, taking that step further now, looking at reviews on, you know, how can we change over our diesel fuel? You know, is it, you know, a simple changeover? What are the options for it? Which need retrofits of the equipment, which are able to be done with the existing equipment? Do we need to drain the tank? Or, you know, these are just day-to-day operational questions that you can start to ask, and you can start to make decisions, I guess, with those bigger pictures in mind. You know, your scope 2 carbon of what you buy, you know, that's reducing your power. And that, you know, we've all done the neighbours improvement reports. We're sort of comfortable with that side of it, and that sort of just extends now through into the CREM curve and making those decisions. So I think there's a lot of new terms out there that people are starting to use, but it sort of comes down, you know, it took me a while to nut through what that actually meant, but it, you know, it's power reduction. It's using your building sensibly, working through it, and having the information to hand to make decisions that have that longer term impact today has been really important for me.
So, Ed, with the properties that you look after, have you noticed a strong link between better green credentials, such as higher neighbours ratings, and better asset performance? So things like occupancy rates, gross asset value, tenant quality, and so forth?
Yeah, it's always been a thing I think the market has kind of struggled to really accurately price and reflect in value. But I think that it's definitely been on the agenda. The green agenda has been around for some time, and it's definitely building with, you know, the current government, and as Emily's talking about there, the net zero and the carbon neutrality campaigns and corporate focus on those initiatives. In the markets that we operate in, we own office buildings in regional locations. By sort of way of background, we're attracted to the sort of yield arbitrage that presents itself in those markets relative to the core CBDs. Green credential requirements in those markets have been a little bit slow to come to the top of the tenant requirement list, but they're definitely coming, and the instances of seeing them within tenant briefs is building. And so once you pass through that gate, you don't go backwards, and it only really builds from there, particularly as we go back to that carbon zero and carbon neutrality plan. So it's fair to say the green wave has hit the regions well and truly, and we can only see it deepening. And I think the probably the next frontier of it all, going from scope 1 to 2, is then our occupiers looking at their scope 3 emissions and looking to the landlord as being part of their supply chain about, well, hey, you guys are a supplier to us, and we have scope 3 emissions that we now need to quantify as part of our neutrality or zero plan. And they're going to be looking at landlords saying, you need to furnish me with the data. And so that's a really interesting piece that will play out in the months and years to come.
So something that's come from the audience for you, Ed, which is the other side of that coin, I guess. You're talking about what landlords are doing. What about tenants? What role do tenants have to play in the sustainable building conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because the landlord's only responsible in most instances for the base buildings. And then what happens within the premises, which is the vast majority of the NLA, or the area of the surface area of the building, is up to what the tenants do. So we are seeing a lot of tenants, and I think this has been around for some time, placing, requirements onto themselves about hitting the particular neighbours rating for their premises, and the requirement for things such as LED lights to be installed, and then really a lot of that, the carbon emissions that have been generated from within the premises is up to the tenant themselves. So I suppose they look at the landlord saying, well, what are you doing? And then you've got to also have a secondary conversation. Well, you guys have also got to understand that a lot of your own destiny can be made by the decisions you make.
But that's interesting, because potentially you could have a tenant inside a neighbour's 4.5 rated building, but they want to operate themselves as a neighbour's 5.5 or something like that. They want to operate at a higher level than the rest of the building.
Yeah.
So they're trying to drive things along as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that will be part of their zero or neutrality strategy.
But I think as well, when you're starting to look at carbon neutral for the buildings themselves, those ratings will start to take into account the whole building. So the ability for a landlord to go, my bit's okay, like the rest's not ours, is starting to diminish. So, the role and the cooperation of the tenants, it's going to just become part and parcel moving forward. Tenant data is going to be key, and tenants are going to want it from us, we're going to want it from them, and that sort of symbiotic relationship has to become the normal in order to sort of get these ratings sort of underway.
So Dave, what are some of the key contributions that operations teams can make to improving sustainability performance, and how's that going to impact asset performance?
So I think it kind of started with the benchmarking, and that's been done by all the kind of the sophisticated property owners. They have an idea as to where each building sits in their kind of overall performance portfolio. And then you go from that benchmarking component into just pure monitoring, like how do we get the data from the major consumers of electricity, and in certain cases still gas and water. And then it's okay, once you have the benchmark, and then you can monitor it, what are we doing to optimize it? And a huge part of that comes into improving the contractor management, like how I go back to that accountability element. In every single one of the buildings that every property owner has, you have the BMS contractor, you have the mechanical contractor, the electrician for the lighting, the plumber for cooling towers, and all of those people play a very, very important role in collaborating to ensuring that the building is actually optimized, and that that the building is resilient and it's able to withstand pressures from reduced occupancy, and there's a better understanding of plant and equipment and an understanding of the life cycle within the equipment usage. So really the role comes down to it depends on how the asset and the operations teams are using the data to actually drive performance. But once they get their hands on good data, then it's like, okay, we have this now, let's go deeper into it.
So obviously all the way through this, all three of you have kind of pointed to the importance of data sharing, collaboration and communication between all the different parties. Just as a general comment from any one of you, is how hard has it been traditionally to get that data? And then how is it being used today? How much easier is it for the data to actually be shared today? Has that changed substantially?
Yeah, absolutely. Before you might get a meter and you might, you get someone to come in and you get some, monthly readings on things. And, now you're looking at real-time data. You've got green lease clauses in there, to openly share. I mean, I know it's some of our other countries, there is no tenant data provided, and I think we're really lucky in Australia that we do have a super transparent market. And obviously each state's got a different way of doing, and New South Wales, the tenants still have a lot of their own direct accounts, but certainly data sharing has become far more commonplace, and the quality of that data and the availability of more real-time data is definitely there as well.
Yeah, and the advent of smart meters has been a huge game changer on that piece, to be able to monitor the data really of the electricity consumption notably, and gas in some instances on an hourly basis is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
That's great.
I might add, Anthony, if you look at the kind of approach we take to kind of get down to that equipment identifying equipment performance and failure and anomalies, and when things do and don't run. Like, the way the technology stack has evolved in the background, if you look at how we acquire the data, and so we take 2.5 billion data points every month from it's a complete MRI scan of all the equipment across Australia, Europe, and now in the US. And we couldn't have done that without the advent of things like AWS and cloud computing, and how to kind of get the data from sites using kind of going out through existing networks. So the data standards have opened up, but equally the back end technology stack has kind of has evolved to allow us to be able to build something that you can kind of end up bringing to clients really cost effectively. Whereas if you go back maybe 15, 20 years ago, it would have been 100 grand up front CapEx, and then, you know, a 7-year payback to do data. Now it's, you know, plug in 53 of Charter Hall's buildings into our platform in under 7 weeks during COVID without visiting one. And that's due to kind of advancements in tech and having good technologists within teams, you know.
And pretty soon, I guess, we'll be asking ChatGPT how to manage our buildings better, and we'll be off off on the next round of how to do things. So, sorry, that was a bit flippant, but let's move on, I think. So when we start to talk about what's at the heart of LaSalle and Strada's offering around property investment management, Ed, when you guys look to acquire new property investments, do you consider how well that building is being managed operationally? Are there any operational metrics in particular that you look at?
Yeah, look, the classic one is the neighbours rating. We've already talked about it, but it's it really is the first port of call to an understanding of how a building is performing operationally. And I think it really is worth taking a step back and looking at how well integrated and how deeply immersed the neighbours process and regime has been integrated into our industry. It's quite remarkable. It's been around for 20 years. They're now it's now offshore. I believe it's been implemented in the UK and maybe Singapore as well. And it's a testament to our industry and the people behind the neighbours rating, the New South Wales government who initiated it originally. That platform has taken off so well, and it is really the first port of call that you look at, and when you are looking at an asset and saying, okay, well, there's a bit of work to be done here. If the rating's low or if the rating's high, then you say, well, we should be seeing this in the operational expenditure of the building. Once you crack open the neighbours rating, that's where things really get interesting, and you can work out where are the low-hanging fruit that might be available to you to reduce the OPEX moving forward. And that's probably, you know, once you get into more of a detailed due diligence assessment. Another key area we like to look at is the maintenance logs of key pieces of plant and equipment, your HVAC, your lifts, and understanding, well, firstly, how frequently are these bits and pieces being serviced, but more to the point, are there recurring issues that are popping up here that haven't been resolved that might indicate an underinvestment by the current owner? And what does that mean for your underwriting? And your neighbours rating will give you clues to that as well. Low neighbours rating generally means up the CapEx budget, and same with the data logs, the maintenance logs of the key pieces of P&E.
So, Dave, is there a risk that financial institutions might penalise or even halt investment in assets that are underperforming in terms of their energy and operational efficiencies?
Oh yeah, look, definitely. I mean, I think we deal with the superannuation funds in Australia and the pension funds globally, and they're well past kind of like promises of performance. And in many cases, I know in one case they've taken money out of a fund, and in at least half a dozen cases they've stopped additional the flow of capital into real estate investment trusts and owners that can't demonstrate that they're going to a granular level and that they have a complete handle on the operational performance and in turn then the emissions. So Ed is exactly right. Like neighbours is a great indicator of it. But more and more, once like all roads lead back to the shareholders, and once they see a data stream and they kind of get a benchmark of a very, very high performing fund, then their kind of request to the owners is, look, this is the standard that you need to be at, which is good, right? Because all of the stuff like that, every single building we end up installing our technology ranges from 15 to like 25% reduction. And then when you roll that across portfolios of assets, it gets very, very meaningful. And in an awful lot of cases, it's no cost and low cost fixes. And when you get into the line items like maintenance, like unplanned and planned maintenance, as I go back to where that collaboration element, if the contractors are able to know the root cause of a problem in a piece of plant and equipment, well, then they can extend the life cycle of it. They can stop it from breaking down, and all of that stuff flows back. Ed touched on it there, but if you're looking after a balance sheet for an asset or for a portfolio of assets, and these unplanned breakdowns come along, they kill profitability. But along the way as well, they're also torching emissions. So,
and it'll be interesting to watch further to that point where some assets are maybe deemed as being unsuitable for a hold by a particular asset. That will present an opportunity for another investor to then make the investment that the current owner is unwilling to do. And as long as that's adequately priced, then there should be a good return at the end of the day for the incoming investor to resolve whatever those life cycle issues are.
Yeah, we had a scenario with 99 Elizabeth Street, and it was a Kaiko property, and they bought the asset, refurbished it. It was designed to run at 4.5 star neighbors, and it now runs at like 5.75. And again, that's that uplift in value, because to buy assets that are underperforming and create the value. And that's, as you say, that's where the kind of more nimble and agile property owners will be able to essentially turn a trick.
Yeah, there's the term that's been banning around is the brown office fund getting in. Yeah, it's interesting.
So, and the interesting part of that is that we start to talk about what some of those investment drivers are, and they're super important. But I mean, Emily, some of the measures of sustainability and operational efficiency are also becoming really critical when people start looking ahead. How do you balance those things between investment drivers and sustainability and operational efficiency?
I think they're almost sort of starting to dovetail into each other. Again, it will depend on what your asset strategy is, what you've purchased, what you want to get out of that. But, ultimately, people want to move towards more sustainable assets. I don't think that's a revolutionary statement. Some of the steps to get there for each building will be economically justifiable today. And others, you want to plan, and they'll be probably market demand led. So, we're seeing that a lot of the large companies now have made, as we have, the carbon commitments, the reductions. So I guess if you're looking at the buildings that they're purchasing, if they're on that carbon journey with their existing buildings and they're looking to purchase additional buildings, they're not going to want to take backward steps when they've got set goals by set dates. So, I think there's a real disconnect between people wanting to meet carbon targets and buildings that are able to meet that obligation. So if you set your building up with a carbon plan, with a neighbours improvement plan, with energy efficiency plans, what you're doing is, giving yourselves an investment rationale that hopefully then, if you're looking to dispose of that asset, opens you up to the widest band of buyers that are there, because people have mandates to meet. And if you can help them meet them by positioning the asset there, then that adds value in your investment rationale as well.
So we've got another question from the audience. And while you're on a roll, Emily, we'll start with you and then we'll throw to Ed if he wants to add some comments to it, and Dave as well, obviously. What are some of the nuances between investment management in retail versus office?
Look, I think it comes down to, what they're used for. Ultimately, your office provider, you're looking at providing, an environment where people can conduct the business. Retail is more about sort of attracting people into the centre. You've got larger amounts of people staying for shorter amounts of time. You've got a larger amount of footfall passing through. So the assets are used in different ways. And you want to be able to position yourself to respond in the best way to how that asset's being used and react to that.
Yeah, and generally speaking, in retail, you're going to have a lot more F&B use, right? And they're a lot more utility intensive than the average office user will be. You've got gas, you've got water, you might have wok burners going on. And so really understanding how that user or that occupant in the retail F&B setting is using the building and the premises is very important, and that you can have a small premise going through a huge amount of electricity or a huge amount of gas and water, and making sure you're understanding, well, and the tenant is understanding as well of what that's doing to their emission footprint, and also to the overall sort of efficiency of the building is significant.
I think it'll be really interesting, you know, degasifying is going to be really interesting, but it's often those restaurants that I think of, you know, it's the quick cooking, the walks, the big ones there, you know, how we're going to degasify those types of things. You know, if you've got a domestic hot water unit or you've got some piece of plant, you know, you can swap out, there's not really a big impact, but you know, it's going to be a difficult conversation with some of those types of users in pushing those types of policies.
Yeah, and a bit of a capex load for either them or the owner.
And I guess we get back again to the granularity of the data that you're getting from across the whole property to understand what's actually not just going on at that macro level of a whole building or a whole floor, but what's going on in, you know, that 5 by 5 meter square corner specifically to find out what's going on.
Yeah.
And I guess that, you know, that drives us back into that data and technology discussion. Dave, you guys work with a large number of REITs and superannuation funds. How are you seeing technology and analytics from platforms like Peak improve the life of asset and fund managers?
I think it probably gives them peace of mind more than anything else, Anthony. Like, it's, you know, our users of the platform tend to be facility managers and national operations managers, and then the contractors who are interacting with the platform when we identify issues. And I think the commentary that comes back from the fund and asset managers that I've spoken to is like, firstly, one person commented on and said, look, it's a great early identifier of talent within like their large portfolio, because they can see what facility managers are responding to the issues and closing out and following up with contractors correctly. And they can also then see into the supply chain, into the contractors, and you can know if, you know, out of 10 BMS companies, like which maintenance team within those companies is responding and actually really engaging with the on-site team. So there's kind of that collaboration, early identifier of talent. But then I go back to the peace of mind, right? When a fund manager asks an asset manager about performance, and they're able to engage with, let's say, a national operation manager and ask detailed questions as to how each asset's performing, and someone's able to come back, like, as opposed to reacting to kind of just a phone call, they're able to respond with kind of like data on the plan and the work that's happened on the optimization. And every single kind of asset and fund manager I've ever spoken to is always says same thing, is like, how can we get more out of what we already have before we open up the checkbook and start doing capex? And the other side is, when the capital expenditure happens, how do you ensure that you're actually getting the, you know, improved thermal comfort in an office environment, or, you know, improved environmental ratings by reduced consumption? And then, like, as they move on that net zero journey, like, it comes down to, the final thing is power purchase agreements. They all want to know, how do I limit the amount of exposure to these power purchase agreements? And how do you kind of get an asset or a portfolio of assets as fit as you possibly can before you have to go to kind of expensive either alternative sources of energy or power purchase agreements?
I think something you've said to me many times is the cheapest energy you can have is the energy you don't use. And I guess that the cheapest assets you can buy are the ones you don't have to buy again. So absolutely, I think some of that rings true. Just one little question that's come from the audience for you, Dave, before I ask the others something, is obviously the introduction of new technologies can be a bit daunting for some. How do you get people on board embracing new technologies when they might be, I'll quote what the person's put in the question, because then I'm not the one who gets on the hook for offending anyone potentially with the words, but if people are a little bit old school and stuck in their ways.
No, like, it's not, I mean, we were guilty of it, Anthony, like 3 or 4 years ago, of kind of sending non-technical people technical information. And it's a terrible experience for the user. And like, our technology was always identifying the root cause of issues, but we weren't getting that user engagement. And it wasn't until we kind of really got ahead of product, our head of product really got into that, the challenge for a facility manager. And then the persona we kind of target is that like old school person who understands the challenges with running large buildings. But at the end of the day, like, you have to make it simple for people. Like, nobody cares what goes on in the background of Google Maps or, you know, Westpac or NAV or like banking software. They just want to get in and have a good user experience. So for us, when we've focused on that user experience and made the onboarding really, really seamless, then like everything went up and to the right in relation to the amount of activity on the platform, in relation to the amount of issues that were closed, and then in turn, you get more engagement and then you get less energy consumption. It just comes down to that user experience, and it's incredibly hard to do correctly because, you know, people just want the outcome. They don't want to know, you know, if your software is any good or like that. They just want to make sure that things are being fixed faster. You know,
sometimes it is about the destination and not the journey. They just want to get there. So Emily, from your perspective, can you talk a bit some of the asset performance benefits that you get from moving towards data-driven maintenance rather than the more traditional approaches?
Yeah, like I think it goes to a lot of what David's just said. I said, like, you know, if you picture sort of a clock, you know, you used to be able to see whether it was working. Whereas now you can open up the back, you can see each of the cogs, you can understand which is working, which isn't working. And just that level of information just lets you make more informed decisions. It lets you make faster decisions, you know, rather than realizing you've got a problem with your chillers because the tenants are phoning you saying the building's hot. You know, you're now getting alerts that you've got a problem with your chiller. You're able to then, you know, repair whatever's burst before you've then got a bigger problem to fix and a more costly problem to fix because that's impacted a larger piece of plant and your tenants don't even know it's happened. So, you know, being able to make those decisions, being able to make more granular decisions, you know, being able to control smaller pieces, more localized pieces of equipment, understand more accurately when to start them, when to stop them. You know, it's like you say, it's money wasted if you're running, and you just can't afford to waste those types of opportunities nowadays. The days are gone when you buy a building and, you know, you've got 10 pages of low-hanging fruit. Most people have worked through a number of those now, and if you're going to get improvements now, you've got to move into slightly more sophisticated methods of doing so.
Yeah, and I think that whole thing about, you know, you're trying to actually make better decisions faster so that you're not solving problems, you're actually stopping them from becoming problems in the first place. So you're not dealing with the complaint from a tenant. The tenant may never know that there was a problem, but you've beaten them to the punch and they haven't had a chance. So, I mean, Ed, I saw you just nodding and smiling there to that. I mean, how are data and analytics helping you improve asset performance? Can you maybe talk about an example you might have there?
Yeah, sure. So we took an asset to market last year in the midst of sort of the market having a bit of a shift in investor appetite. And in the 12 months leading up to taking the asset to market, we substantially improved the neighbours' energy rating and implemented a 6-star water rating at the same time. And, you know, it involved much of the usual fine-tuning of the BMS, detailed review of the performance of key pieces of plant and equipment, a pretty limited CapEx spend, but a CapEx spend. And without that material uplift in the neighbours rating, particularly with what happened in the broader market, we probably could have gotten away with it 12 or 18 months prior. But the market started, you know, has become more selective in its allocation of capital. And without that deep dive into the data and deep dive into what was causing some of the operational issues, I think it would have been a pretty different outcome on where we realised liquidity and the interest that we achieved along the way.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that we've mentioned in that last little round was we talked a bit about tenants and their expectations and what they see and what they feel when they're in a building. I mean, ultimately, the success or failure of, I guess, of a building investment comes down to whether you can get some tenants in the place. You can have a beautiful building, but if there's no one inside it, it's kind of not going to generate any value for the investors. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do to really support tenants well to really boost an asset's value and returns. And if a core asset is fully occupied, but then occupancy starts to drop as tenants fail to renew, what are some of the strategies that you might be able to use to bring some tenants back?
Well, the first thing you've got to work out there is why the tenant's leaving. It goes back to your comment before about energy saved or the best energy saving is the energy that you don't use. Having tenants leave a building in mass, if this is what the sort of example or question's referring to, you've got to work out what's happening. And hopefully you've got a decent idea of that initially, and you're underway in resolving it, because that's before you attract a new tenant, you're going to have resolved what was the root cause of tenants departing. So part of that is obviously having a good relationship with your tenants and being engaged with them, and hopefully you don't find yourself in the situation where something is so terminal that a tenant elects to move. But when you are backfilling, which is a part of what we do, you've got to really drill down into, well, it's pretty simple. What's the market demanding? What do the tenants in that particular market expect? What's your competitor set delivering? And then what is your competitive advantage relative to your competitor set? So what does your building do better, if anything, or hopefully something, than their competitor set? And how do you then exploit that advantage, and making sure that your tenants and the market know about how you deliver that competitive advantage?
Have those expectations changed since the pandemic?
Oh yeah, look, I think there still remains a very high scrutiny of cleaning, in particular, and also on ventilation. I can't see those two shifts in client expectation or tenant expectation moving back to what they were pre-pandemic levels. Tenants want to know a lot about the movement of air and the velocity of airflow within a tenancy, and there's a lot more scrutiny on base building cleaning.
Is that something you're seeing as well, Emily? Are there any other things that you're seeing where office tenant expectations have changed?
Look, I think, it was a massive shift that we've had, but I think those core features probably carry through our assets as well. People want to understand what you're doing a little bit more. They want to feel in control of the environment. There's so much else going on in the world. The businesses have got so much going on. You have to be their sort of constant, their stability. They want to understand that things are being done. They're being done to a good standard. And you've got to have a team that can communicate that back to the tenants as well. So that gives them that comfort, gives them that stability. They understand the building that they're in, what it's about, and they know that they just don't need to worry about it. They just don't want to have to think about it. And if they're comfortable in what you're doing and how you're doing it, they can just get on with their work.
So are there any other keys, Emily, to maintaining a great tenant experience? How important is maintaining that experience for the superior asset financials?
Oh, look, it's absolutely key. If your tenants come to you when their lease is, coming up for expiry, if you're the one they come and talk to you when they need more space, if they've got comfort that you understand their business and, that you are providing a space that they feel comfortable with, we are in an industry where sometimes lack of communication from your tenants is a good thing, which is, a bit of a bizarre environment, but people have got businesses to run, and there's a really, important balance between providing the environment where they can just do that and they're comfortable and happy in doing that, and also balancing having an appropriate level of communication with them so that they know who you are, they know who your team are, they know who they can talk to if they need to, and that you're the first port of call when they've got changing requirements or additional requirements, or, you can talk to them if they've got a reduction in requirements and understand what that is. So, our business is about, leasing space, and if we're not able to do that and retain people in that, then we're not doing good business, I guess.
Well, I guess it's, the building is a utility. When it doesn't work, you hear about it, but I guess, sometimes no news is good news. If you don't hear them complaining about the building, they must be doing the right things. So Dave, how can the ops team drive a superior experience for tenants and building users?
So I think for the tenants, and the role we end up playing with the ops team is just removing any elements of friction, right? Like, everybody's worked in an office that's either too hot or too cold, and it's just a terrible experience. And it's not something that should happen. And when you can get to the root cause of an issue, it's something that doesn't happen. So one of our largest clients, 60% of their tenant complaints were air conditioning related. So we ended up working all the way through that to try, and we got it well below 10%. And then we moved on to the next thing, the next kind of friction element, which was lifts, and getting data from lift performance and ensuring then that the maintenance and the operation of the lift was up to a standard across a full portfolio. Because it all comes down to that tenant experience, and in many ways they should have no friction. You know, when they're occupying high performing assets and they're paying a certain price per square meter, well then, you know, they shouldn't have to have, you know, bringing a jacket to work in the summer because you're freezing cold. And equally, when buildings are doing that, they're using excessive chiller energy, which in turn is degrading the life cycle of the chiller. Or alternatively, if you're calling on gas and boilers and stuff, if they're still in buildings, you know, you have heating, fighting, cooling, and it's all totally unnecessary. So the role kind of we play and the ops teams play is like we built the software to try and, you know, identify where these problems were occurring, and then we, you know, try and build that good user interface so that the ops teams are able to fix the problems quickly.
So we just have this is a bit of a general question. It doesn't quite fit into anything specific we've spoken about so far, but I think it's an interesting question to delve into. It's maybe we'll start with Ed first. How do you manage high electricity costs?
Well, yeah, it's something I think we're all struggling with at the moment. The impact of what electricity markets have done across our outgoings budgets over the last 12, 18 months has been material. I suppose the simplest way of answering the question is looking at your consumption and looking at what are the levers you can pull immediately that can result in reduced consumption. And that will come down to fine-tuning the BMS, making sure your operating hours of your HVAC in particular is optimized. And that's your big one. And if you haven't done that, then you've got some low-hanging fruit in front of you. Right down to you know, are your lighting in your car park, for example, is that on LED and is it on sensor? Same with your fire stairs. That's going to be a bit of a slower burn to see that impact come through into your bills, but it's equally as important. And I suppose as well, on top of all of that is look at your contract. What are you procuring? Is when's your contract up, and can you tender? See if you can break early, if that's possible. That can be difficult, but speak to your broker as well.
I think on top of that, where you've had projects that you've looked at before that maybe weren't stacking up for you on a payback period, you know, where your electricity rates have suddenly started going, you know, very quickly upwards. At what point do those start to, you know, become attractive? Don't forget to go back and look at that. You know, just because it didn't stack up before, you know, suddenly you've seen a big rate increase, you know, go back, have a look, see if those projects now look more viable, you know, have a payback period that sits within your investment strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is sometimes a project that didn't stack up previously may actually now stack up in a very different way. So it is worth going back, looking back at the stuff that you let go for some reason previously that may actually work better for you now. So just a couple of final questions before we wrap up for today. This has been like a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this, and I've certainly learned a lot, even though I've worked with the CIM team for quite some time. I love these events because we keep learning so much more about what's actually going on and how things are changing. Ed, you work with up to 5 different property management companies. When you work with these external firms appointed to your buildings, how do you maintain control and accountability over ops across that whole portfolio?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first things first is making sure that your PMA is on point and that your scope of works is really clear and that the scope has been adequately communicated to your managing agents. Following that, and Emily touched on it before, it's the importance of the monthly management meeting, which serves not only as sort of work in progress, but also incorporating your longer term strategy on the asset and how are you chipping away at delivering those longer lead time pieces that you want to see delivered at the asset. And that sort of, builds back into the adding value concept that we kicked the session off with. One small thing we do here is at Strada with our monthly management meetings is we let the FM, we sort of skip forward to the FM section, the operations section. The meeting might go for an hour or an hour and a half, and the poor FM can sit there sort of twiddling their thumbs, talking about it as we talk about arrears and upcoming leases and things, which is important for them to know, but it's not really their sort of day-to-day business. So we like to go straight into the FM and then hear from the FM. We have the discussion, and then they're free to leave the meeting to go back to their post essentially and resume their day. And I think that bodes really well with them because they see that we're respecting their time, and it gives them back whatever it is, half an hour, 45 minutes. Another thing we do is that we make sure that we know the contact details and have not too frequent, but where we need to make contact with our service contractors from an R&M perspective. So we want to know who our HVAC technician is. We want to know who our lift technician is. The property manager will remain the first port of contact for those individuals, and that role remains undisturbed. But in the instance where we need to, we're told, that something needs to be fixed and there's a major piece of capex, we like to get on the phone with them in advance and really understand so that there's no translation error. We get the word straight from the contractor themselves about what needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So Emily, there's some macroeconomic and other headwinds that are facing the industry, and we kind of hear about those quite a bit now. How can operations help maintain asset resilience when you're trying to navigate this, quite challenging world?
Yeah, look, I think we've been in a sort of growth environment for such a long time. It's definitely been a massive shift, to see, cap rates starting to increase rather than coming down. You're not getting the returns now from cap rate compression. So the first port of call there is turning straight to your asset management teams and saying, okay, well, it's on you now. How we get our returns, how we generate those returns, that's on you guys. We need you to generate value in these buildings. And, a lot of that comes through from what the guys on the team are doing. It's making sure that they understand, like we've said a number of times, what the big picture is. Sometimes when they're, in the middle and the day-to-day, it's really hard to come up and think about the big picture. So, taking the time to just, remind, talk to them, understand the pain points, help them solve them. We need to keep tenants happy. We need to retain and, drive leasing. We need to keep our buildings operating the most efficiently as we can. These aren't, groundbreaking things, but doing them in a way that we are able to, tweak and pull and get the better returns out of it. We've got such sophisticated platforms to enable us to do that really well nowadays. We just have to focus on those items to sort of generate those returns.
Dave, I've got a question from the audience just before I ask you to wrap up for us. When you guys come into a building that may already be, working really well and highly efficient, like a 6-star building, what can analytics do for a property that's at that point?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because with an awful lot of the clients we work with, and like a lot of the Charter Hall, the GPT, the Lend Lease portfolio, it's very high performing as is. So it comes down to then ensuring and protecting those ratings, right? And even in high performing assets, you still have other line items on the balance sheet. Like we spoke earlier about maintenance, planned and unplanned maintenance. And, we have a scenario with QIC, for example, where we took 89% off the BMS maintenance contract by moving into a data-driven maintenance operation. So like when, Neighbours is absolutely fantastic, but when like the Australian real estate investment trust sector is leading, it just is across the world. So none of the owners in Australia have stopped once they got to 6-star. They're like, okay, well, what else can we do? How can we reduce hot and cold complaints? How can we dig into other line items? And as Emily said, like when you end up having to turn around to the operation, the asset team say it's up to you now to generate more returns to the business. So you have to get into more granularity. You have to end up empowering kind of the team that are there on the ground with the right forms of technology. And then promote the collaboration. Like every single business is a people business, like no different from lawyers or accountants or real estate investment trusts. So when you can have a good culture and a culture of collaboration between consultants, contractors, suppliers, FMs, asset managers, And if everyone's working seamlessly together towards like a common goal, like the natural byproduct of that is awesome sustainability. And look, technology has a huge part to play in that, and that's kind of our role.
So we've just reached the end of our time. We've hit the allotted hour that we asked people to be here for. So thanks very much to Emily, Edward and Dave for their time today. I found this fascinating. I think if I was going to walk away with one or two things that were super critical, it's that communication is key, but then being able to actually communicate the right information clearly and in a way that allows people to take positive action is the super important thing. And that's why I think, you know, when you talk to your FMs, being able to actually give them hard data that says something specific and that they can act on makes such a big difference to the success of a building investment and building operation. So thank you to Ed, Emily and Dave for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience. I think we got to all the questions that were asked as we went along, but if you did have any further questions, please feel free to send them through and we'll get back to you afterwards. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a very short survey for you when we hit the close button on the webinar. Please do that. It's really important to us. And I promise it will only take you less than a minute to get through. So to everybody, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks. Thank you.